Look at her. You think she knows the first thing about the dark? The night belongs to us, little lady, not to observers. The crowd of young, eager soldiers, clad in the latest multicam black and bristling with high-tech gear, laughed. It was a nervous, sycophantic sound, the kind of laughter that seeks favor from a superior by sharing in his casual cruelty. The man who had spoken, Staff Sergeant Rex Thorne, was a mountain of muscle and confidence, his voice a gravelly boom that filled the cavernous briefing room of the Nocturne Advanced Night Operations Facility. He gestured with a thumb toward the lone figure sitting apart from the main group, a woman whose presence was an anomaly in this temple of tactical machismo. She was Sergeant Anya Sharma, and she offered no reaction to the insult. Her gaze remained fixed on the piece of equipment in her hands, a simple, almost archaic-looking compass, its brass casing worn smooth by years of use. Her uniform was clean but unadorned, lacking the Velcro patches and custom insignia that Thorne's team flaunted like peacocks. She was a study in quiet efficiency, her movements economical and precise as she methodically checked each piece of her minimalist kit. There was no wasted motion, no theatrical flourish, just a silent, disciplined ritual that seemed to create a bubble of profound calm around her. Thorne saw weakness in her stillness, an absence of the aggressive energy he equated with competence. But when the base commander, Colonel Evans, observing from the shadowed back of the amphitheater, saw her stance, the perfect, balanced posture of a predator at rest, he saw something else entirely. He saw a ghost from his own past, a whisper of a forgotten kind of war, a time before digital overlays and thermal imaging, when soldiers had to truly listen to the darkness instead of just looking through it. He saw a professional. If you believe true strength needs no announcement, type silence below. The air in the Nocturne facility hummed with the low thrum of power, servers, ventilation, and the latent energy of millions of dollars of simulation technology. It smelled of ozone, cool metal, and a faint, clean scent of weapon lubricant. Thorne paced before his men like a caged bear, his lecture a mix of tactical doctrine and self-aggrandizement. He spoke of owning the night, of dominating the battle space through technological superiority and overwhelming force. His philosophy was one of noise and violence, of being the monster in the dark that lesser men feared. Sharma, in her corner, continued her silent preparations. She wasn't on the manifest for the evening's exercise. She was listed merely as an observer from Training and Doctrine Command, there to evaluate the facility's new hyper-realistic simulation suite. This vague assignment made her an easy target for Thorne, a man whose ego was as large as the facility itself. He saw her as a bureaucrat, a pen-pusher sent to get in his way. The fact that she was a woman of slight build and unassuming demeanor only solidified his prejudice. He thrived on the validation of his subordinates, and making an example of the quiet outsider was an easy way to reinforce his alpha status. Her silence was a vacuum, and his arrogance rushed to fill it, growing louder and more condescending with every passing moment. He saw her simple gear, a rifle without a dozen attachments, a chest rig that was sleek and functional rather than bulky and intimidating, and he scoffed. He saw her calm, and he mistook it for fear. He saw her discipline, and he mistook it for passivity. The assumptions he made were a fortress built on the sand of his own ignorance, a fortress that seemed impenetrable to him and his followers. They did not see the subtle clues that Evans did. They didn't notice that the scuff marks on her boots were from rock and earth, not polished concrete floors. They didn't see that the rifle she held, a stripped-down M4, was balanced in her hands not like a tool, but like an extension of her own body, a familiarity born from thousands of hours of carry. They didn't notice the faint, pale scar that traced the line of her jaw, a story written in a language they couldn't comprehend. They saw only what their leader told them to see, an outsider, an observer, a woman who did not belong in their world. They saw a sheep in a den of wolves, never once considering that she might be the wolf that had learned to walk in perfect, unassuming silence. The condescension continued, a relentless barrage aimed at the stone wall of Sharma's composure. Thorn, emboldened by her lack of reaction, picked up a piece of her kit, a simple nylon pouch containing a field-dressed medical kit. What is this? A first aid kit from the last century. Where's your automated tourniquet? Your chest seal with a one-way valve? Ma'am, in our world, seconds count. This antique stuff will get you killed. He tossed it back on her table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The trainees chuckled again, more confidently this time. Sharma simply picked up the pouch, inspected it for any damage from the fall, and placed it back in its designated spot on her rig. Her fingers moved with the unthinking grace of a surgeon arranging her instruments. Each action was deliberate, serene, a testament to a discipline so deeply ingrained it had become instinct. The room was a theater of contrasts. Thorn's loud, expansive gestures against Sharma's quiet, contained focus. His booming voice echoed off the concrete walls, while her silence seemed to absorb the sound, rendering it hollow and meaningless. From his perch in the shadows, Colonel Evans watched the performance with a growing sense of unease, not for Sharma, but for Thorn. Evans was a man who had seen true competence in the smoking ruins of forgotten battlefields, and he knew it rarely announced itself with a bullhorn. It was quiet. It was efficient. It looked, to the untrained eye, exactly like Sergeant Anya Sharma. He recognized the pattern. He had seen young, arrogant officers underestimate a seasoned, non-commissioned officer before, and it never ended well for the officer. He saw the way Sharma's eyes, when they briefly scanned the room, weren't just looking, they were cataloging. She noted the exits, the placement of the fire extinguishers, the reflection of the overhead lights in the polished floor. She was assessing her environment constantly, a low-level hum of situational awareness that never switched off. Thorn, meanwhile, was only aware of himself, the star of his own show. He had created a narrative in his head where he was the grizzled gatekeeper of an elite world, and she was the unqualified intruder. This narrative was a shield, protecting him from the uncomfortable possibility that his definition of strength was tragically incomplete. Her silence was not submission. It was a refusal to participate in his pathetic drama. She did not need to win a verbal sparring match with a man like Thorn because the contests she prepared for were not measured in words, but in outcomes. Her lack of engagement was, in itself, the most profound statement of superiority. It told him, in a language he was incapable of understanding, that he did not matter. He was a temporary obstacle, a piece of noisy terrain to be navigated with patience and economy of effort. The final bell for the exercise was about to ring, and Thorn delivered his parting shot. "All right, everyone, time to go work. Try to keep up, ma'am. Don't want you getting lost in the dark." He turned his back on her, a final act of dismissal, and led his team into the antechamber of the simulation deck. The heavy steel door hissed shut behind them, leaving Sharma alone in the vast briefing room with the hum of the machines and the weight of unearned scorn. She took a slow, deep breath, the first sign of any change in her demeanor, and her eyes closed for a single, long second. It was not a look of frustration or anger. It was a moment of centering, of shedding the noise of the outside world and retreating into the perfect, ordered silence of her own mind. When she opened them again, they were clear, focused, and utterly devoid of emotion. The observer was ready to observe. The simulation began. On the massive, wall-sized screens in the control room, a dozen different video feeds bloomed to life. Body cams, drone overviews, and static environmental cameras painted a comprehensive, godlike view of the battle space. The scenario was a classic, a high-value target extraction from a fortified urban compound. Thorn's team, designated Alpha, moved with the aggressive, fluid confidence he had instilled in them. They stacked up on the compound's perimeter, their movements crisp and well-rehearsed. In the control room, Thorn's voice, patched in from his comms, was a running commentary of self-assurance. "Breachers on my mark. We go loud, shock and awe. They won't know what hit them. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan." The initial breach was explosive and violent. Alpha Team flooded the first building, neutralizing the scripted, predictable resistance with ruthless efficiency. Thorne's voice dripped with satisfaction. But then, the scenario deviated. The aggressor force, a visiting team from a specialized unit known for their unconventional tactics, wasn't playing by the book. They melted away from the initial assault, ceding the outer building. They used the labyrinthine alleys of the simulated city to their advantage, initiating a campaign of harassment and misdirection. A sniper, hidden in a position that wasn't on any of the schematics, pinned down half of Alpha Team. An improvised explosive device, triggered by a tripwire no one saw, notionally took out their medic. The clean, surgical operation devolved into a chaotic, desperate firefight. Panic began to creep into the comms chatter. Thorne's confident commands became strained, then angry, then confused. His team, trained for overwhelming force against a static enemy, was being dismantled by an enemy they couldn't find, an enemy that was using the darkness not as a cloak but as a weapon. In the control room, the atmosphere grew tense. The civilian simulation director, a man named Peterson, chewed on his pen, his face etched with concern. The exercise was spiraling into a total failure. "Colonel," he said, turning to Evans, "I think we need to call a Red X. Alpha Team is combat ineffective." "They're walking into an ambush." Evans didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on one small monitor in the corner, showing the live feed from the briefing room, where Sharma sat, perfectly still, watching the main screens with an unreadable expression. She hadn't moved a muscle in 20 minutes. Evans saw Thorne's strategy for what it was, a hammer that saw every problem as a nail. But the aggressors weren't a nail. They were water, flowing around the hammer and drowning it. Thorne's team was trying to fight the darkness itself, and they were losing badly. Finally, as the last two members of Alpha Team were cornered in a blind alley, the call came over the comms, Thorne's voice ragged with defeat. "Control, this is Alpha Lead. We're compromised. Mission is a wash." Peterson reached for the master abort button. "Wait," Evans said, his voice quiet but absolute. Peterson's hand froze. Evans walked over to the comms panel that linked to the briefing room. He pressed the button. "Sergeant Sharma." Her voice came back instantly, crisp and clear, with no hint of surprise. "Sir." Evans looked at the chaotic tactical display, then back at the thought of the quiet woman in the other room. "The simulation is now live for you. Your objective is the HVT. Rules of engagement are your discretion. How do you copy?" There was a brief pause, not of hesitation, but of acknowledgement. "Solid copy, sir." Evans turned to Peterson. "Keep it running." Peterson looked at him, bewildered. "Sir, with all due respect, what can one person do?" Evans's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Observe." A new icon appeared on the tactical map, a single blue dot labeled Observer. It blinked once at the insertion point, the edge of the simulated city, and then began to move. But did not move like the clustered, panicked red icons of Thorne's team. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, flowing along the edges of the map, hugging the deepest pockets of shadow. In the control room, they switched one of the main screens to her body cam. The image was disorienting at first. It was low to the ground, steady, and panned with an unnatural smoothness. She wasn't running or even jogging. She was gliding, her steps perfectly silent. She did not use her weapon-mounted flashlight, relying instead on the ambient, simulated moonlight and her own natural night vision. She did not move through the darkness. She was a current within it, an indivisible part of the whole. The aggressor team, flushed with their victory over Alpha, had grown cocky. Their comms chatter, audible to the control room, was triumphant and unprofessional. They were resetting their positions, preparing to hunt down the last remnants of Thorne's squad. They had no idea a new player had entered the game. The first one went down without a sound. He was guarding a key intersection, his thermal optics scanning the main thoroughfare. Sharma approached from his rear, using the sound of a distant, simulated wind generator to mask the whisper of her movement. The body cam feed showed her hand, gloved and steady, reaching out. A quick, precise motion. The aggressor's icon on the tactical map flickered and went gray. Neutralized. No ganchat, no stragel. The remaining aggressors didn't even notice he was gone for a full 2 minutes. The next two were taken out as a pair. They were holed up on a rooftop, providing overwatch. Sharma scaled the building's maintenance ladder, her movements as fluid and silent as a spider. The body cam showed her peering over the ledge, studying their positions, their breathing patterns, the rhythm of their scans. She didn't engage them directly. Instead, she tossed a small, spent shell casing across the graveled roof. The both turned toward the sound, their focus momentarily broken. In that fraction of a second, she was over the ledge and on them. Two more icons went gray. In the control room, a stunned silence had fallen. Thorn, who had been extracted to a virtual casualty collection point, now stood behind the controllers, his face a mask of disbelief. He was watching a ghost at work. This wasn't combat as he knew it. This was something else entirely. It was an art form. The aggressor team leader, a seasoned operator in his own right, finally realized something was wrong. His confident tone vanished, replaced by urgent, clipped commands. All stations, sound off. I want a status report now. The replies were fragmented, confused. Two stations were silent. Where is Spectre? Where is Ghost? Silence. Panic began to set in. He was being hunted. He and his last remaining teammate fell back to the building holding the HVT, a two-story warehouse, that barricaded the door, setting up a crossfire. It was a fatal mistake. They assumed their enemy would come through the door. Sharma's body cam showed her on the roof of an adjacent building. She took out a small length of rope and a grappling hook. With a single, fluid toss, she secured a line, and then she rappelled down, not to the ground, but to a second-story window of the warehouse. The window was locked. The camera focused on her hands as she produced a small, thin piece of metal. A few deft, delicate movements, and the lock clicked open. She slid the window up without a sound and slipped inside. The two aggressors were downstairs, their weapons trained on the main entrance, their senses screaming at the silence. Sharma was already on the second-floor catwalk, directly above them. She didn't fire. She simply watched, her breathing slow and even. Then, with perfect timing, she dropped a smoke grenade. Not a military one, but a small commercial-grade pellet she had in a pouch, something that produced just enough smoke to cloud their expensive optics without making a loud hiss. Confused, the two men stood up, trying to peer through the haze. It was all the opening she needed. Two quick, suppressed shots, so close together they sounded like one. The final two aggressor icons went gray. The simulation was over. The HVT was secure. The control room was a tomb. The only sound was the gentle hum of the servers. Everyone stared at the screens, at the single, steady blue standing over the objective. Thorn whispered a single phrase, a question filled with a terrifying awe he had never known. Who is she? The heavy door to the control room hissed open, and Sergeant Sharma stepped inside. She moved with the same quiet grace she had displayed in the simulation, her face calm, her posture relaxed. She walked to the central console, unclipped her comms unit, and placed it gently on the surface. The silence in the room was absolute, a palpable thing that pressed in on everyone. The trainees who had laughed at her now stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes. They had just watched a single soldier dismantle a team of experts with the efficiency of a natural disaster. Thorn was frozen, his earlier arrogance shattered into a million pieces, replaced by a raw, humbling confusion. He looked at Sharma, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not the unassuming observer he had mocked, but a figure of immense, terrifying competence. It was Colonel Evans who finally broke the silence. He walked calmly to the main console, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the polished floor. He didn't look at Thorn or the trainees. His attention was fixed on a console's keyboard. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice level and authoritative, "please bring up service file 776-1 Peterson," still looking dazed, typed in the code. A secure military personnel file began to load on the main screen, the one that had just shown Sharma's ghostly takedown of the aggressor team. A name appeared at the top. Sharma, NY. SGT. Then, The data began to populate the screen, and with each new line of text, a collective, unspoken gasp seemed to ripple through the room. The narrator's voice could have read it like a litany, a recitation of impossible feats. Unit 14 Special Reconnaissance Detachment. The room stirred. The 14th SRD wasn't a real unit, not officially. It was a ghost, a myth whispered about in secure facilities and forward operating bases, a Tier 1 special mission unit that specialized in deep, solo infiltration and intelligence gathering. They didn't kick down doors. They were the shadows that told you which doors to kick. They didn't exist, and yet, here was one of them, standing in the flesh. The screen continued to populate. Combat hours, night operations, 4,280. A number so ludicrously high, it had to be a typo. Most elite operators were lucky to log a quarter of that in a career. Medals and commendations, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with V-Device, Purple Heart. The list went on, a cascade of the nation's highest awards for valor, each one representing a story of unimaginable courage and skill. Mission classifications: Top Secret //SCI / No Foreign. A list of code names followed. Operation Wintershade, Operation Serpent's Coil, Operation Silent Hammer. Names that would never be declassified. Missions that had shaped global events from the deepest shadows, executed by operators whose existence was a carefully guarded secret. The file was a portrait of a warrior who lived and operated on a plane of existence, so far beyond Thorne's understanding that it might as well have been magic. He had been mocking a living legend. He had been lecturing a master on the fundamentals of her craft. The sheer, breathtaking scale of his own ignorance washed over him, a cold, sickening tide. Colonel Evans turned away from the screen, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the trainees before finally landing on Staff Sergeant Thorne. His voice was not angry. It was far worse. It was disappointed, the quiet, cutting tone of a teacher addressing a student who had failed the most fundamental of lessons. Staff Sergeant Thorne, he began, you have the best night fighting equipment money can buy. You have access to the most advanced training facility in the world. You have a team of strong, motivated soldiers. And you failed. He let the words hang in the air. You failed because you made the most dangerous assumption a soldier can make. You assumed that your gear makes you a warrior. You assumed that your noise equals strength. You assumed that what you see on the surface is the whole truth. He took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to lean in to hear. That equipment, he said, gesturing to the gear Thorne's team wore, is a crutch. It helps you see in the dark, but it doesn't teach you how to listen to it. It doesn't teach you how to feel it. It doesn't teach you how to become part of it. You were so busy trying to dominate the night, you never bothered to understand it. He then turned his gaze to Sharma, who had remained perfectly still, a silent observer to her own vindication. Sergeant Sharma's unit, Evans continued, his voice now filled with a deep, profound respect, operates on a different philosophy. They don't dominate the darkness. They cooperate with it. They understand that silence is a weapon, that patience is a force multiplier, and that true competence doesn't need to advertise. It just is. He paused, letting the lesson sink in. The trainees looked down at their feet, a flush of shame on their faces. They had been complicit in Thorne's arrogance, and now they were sharing in his humiliation. Evans faced Sharma directly. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. The air in the room seemed to crackle with a sudden, formal energy. In a voice that was crisp, clear, and filled with the weight of his rank and experience, he said, "Sergeant Sharma," and then he executed a perfect formal salute. It was not the casual gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was the salute of a warrior acknowledging a master. It was a gesture of profound respect, a public admission that in the world that truly mattered, the world of skill, courage, and professionalism, she stood on higher ground. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the trainees followed their colonel's lead. Their arms snapped up in salute, their eyes fixed on the quiet woman they had so foolishly underestimated. Finally, Rex Thorne, his face pale, his jaw tight with the painful weight of his shattered ego, slowly, shakily, raised his own hand to his brow. His salute was a confession, an apology, and a vow, all in one silent gesture. Anya Sharma held their salutes for a moment, her expression unchanging. Then she returned a single, perfect salute to Colonel Evans, a gesture of respect between peers. The age of assumption was over. The lesson had begun. The story of what happened in the Nocturne facility spread not like wildfire, but like a ghost. It wasn't shouted from the rooftops. It was whispered in hushed tones in the corners of mess halls. It was a quiet data burst on secure comms channels between operators in different theaters of war. It was a story told over cheap beer in darkened barracks rooms, a modern military fable passed from one soldier to another. The details, as they always do, became embellished. In some versions, she took out 20 aggressors. In others, she did it blindfolded. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged and potent. It was the story of the quiet sergeant who came from nowhere and reminded an entire base what true professionalism looked like. It was a story about how the loudest voice in the room is often the most insecure, and how silence could be the ultimate expression of confidence. The legend of the Shadow of Sharma became a cautionary tale for the arrogant and an inspiration for the humble. The most profound transformation, however, occurred in Staff Sergeant Rex Thorne. He was not disciplined in any official capacity. Colonel Evans knew that public humiliation was a far more effective corrective than a negative counseling statement. For days, Thorne was a ghost himself, avoiding eye contact, his booming voice reduced to a barely audible rasp. He replayed the simulation in his mind 1,000 times, each viewing a fresh wave of shame. He saw his own blustering, his own ignorance, his own childish need for validation, and he was disgusted. He could have requested a transfer. He could have let his shame fester into resentment. But somewhere, buried beneath the layers of ego, was the core of a good soldier. And that soldier knew that this failure was not an end, but a beginning. It was a gift, a painful but necessary lesson that could, if he let it, make him better. A week after the incident, he sought out Sergeant Sharma. He found her not in a high-tech training room, but on a simple 100-meter outdoor range, practicing basic marksmanship with her unadorned rifle. She was firing slow, deliberate shots, her focus absolute. Thorne stood at a respectful distance, waiting for her to finish her magazine. When she was done, she cleared her weapon and turned to him, her expression neutral. Thorne did not offer a clumsy, fumbling apology. He knew that words were cheap, the very currency he had so foolishly overspent. Instead, he stood at attention. "Sergeant Sharma," he said, his voice quiet and formal. "I request permission to receive instruction. I want you to teach me. Teach my men what you know." Sharma studied him for a long moment. Her eyes were not judgmental, nor were they forgiving. They were analytical. She was assessing his sincerity, his readiness to unlearn everything he thought he knew. She saw the broken pride in his posture, but she also saw a flicker of genuine humility, a desire to rebuild himself on a stronger foundation. She gave a single, small nod. "Understood," she said. "Training begins at 0500 tomorrow, at the old obstacle course. No gear, just PT uniform, that was all. There was no lecture, no I told you so, just a new mission." For Thorne, it was a lifeline. It was the beginning of his own journey out of the darkness of his ego and into the light of true competence. The training that followed was brutal in its simplicity. Sharma did not run them through complex simulations or lecture them on advanced tactics. She took them back to the very beginning. She made them crawl through mud in the pouring rain, teaching them how to move with the land, not just over it. She had them sit in a forest for hours on end, perfectly still, learning to distinguish the natural sounds of the night from the unnatural ones. She taught them to see without technology, to listen without electronics, to feel the shift of the wind on their skin and understand what it meant. At first, Thorne's men were resistant. This was not the high-speed, door-kicking training they were used to. It felt remedial, almost insulting. But Thorne, now her most dedicated student, enforced her will with a quiet, newfound authority. "You think you're too good to learn how to listen?" he would ask them, his voice laced with the memory of his own failure. "I thought I was too. Now shut up and learn." Slowly, miraculously, they began to change. They started to understand that what she was teaching them was not a collection of techniques, but a philosophy. It was a way of seeing the world not as a stage for their own actions, but as a complex system to which they had to adapt. They learned patience. They learned humility. They learned that the most effective weapon in their arsenal was a disciplined mind. The highlight of their training was when she finally took them back into the Nocturne facility. But this time, there were no guns, no objectives. She simply turned off all the lights, plunging the vast, cavernous space into absolute blackness. "Your task," she said, her voice a calm presence in the void, "is to cross this room without making a sound and without bumping into a single obstacle. You have 1 hour for the first attempt." It was chaos. Men stumbled, cursed, and crashed into walls. On the second attempt, it was slightly better. By the 10th attempt, they were beginning to move like ghosts, using memory, touch, and a heightened sense of spatial awareness to navigate the invisible world. They were unlearning their dependence on technology and rediscovering the dormant senses within themselves. The unofficial renaming of the facility's most difficult infiltration course happened organically. It had been called the Gauntlet, a name that reflected Thorne's old philosophy of brute force. A young trainee, after successfully navigating it using Sharma's methods, called it Sharma's Run. The name stuck. It was a testament to the paradigm shift she had engineered. It was no longer about conquering the dark. It was about becoming part of it. Thorne watched his team evolve, his heart swelling with a kind of pride he had never known before. It wasn't the selfish pride of a leader whose team reflected his own glory. It was the humble pride of a teacher watching his students surpass him. He knew they were becoming better soldiers, better men, because of the quiet woman who had shattered his world only to help him rebuild it, stronger than ever before. Sharma, for her part, remained the same. She taught with a quiet, relentless patience, never raising her voice, never offering praise or condemnation. Her standard was perfection, and she simply expected them to meet it. Her validation was not given in words, but in the silent nod she would give when a soldier finally mastered a difficult skill. For these men, that nod became more valuable than any medal. A year passed. Sergeant Anya Sharma was gone, reassigned as silently as she had arrived. There was no farewell ceremony, no plaque on the wall with her name. Her official record at the base still listed her as a temporary observer from Tradoc. It was as if she had never been there at all. But her presence remained, a powerful, echoing legacy that had fundamentally altered the culture of the institution. Staff Sergeant Rex Thorne now stood where he once had, in the briefing room of the Nocturne facility, addressing a new class of young, eager soldiers. But the man was unrecognizable from the one who had stood there a year before. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a calm, centered confidence. His voice was no longer a boom, but a measured, authoritative tone that commanded attention through its clarity, not its volume. He was teaching them about night operations, but his lesson was vastly different. He spoke not of domination, but of adaptation. He spoke not of technology, but of mindset. He told them that the night was not their enemy to be conquered, nor their kingdom to be owned, but a complex environment that demanded respect, patience, and humility. To illustrate his point, he gestured to a wall on the far side of the briefing room. There, preserved behind a small, square pane of museum-quality plexiglass, was a section of the wall from the indoor range. In the exact center of it was a single, clean hole in the thick steel plating. That, Thorne said, his voice dropping with reverence, is the standard. The recruits looked at the hole, confused. One of them finally raised a hand. "Staff Sergeant, what is it? What's the story?" Thorne allowed a small, knowing smile to touch his lips. "That is a single 556mm round, fired from a standard issue M4 rifle at a distance of 300 meters in near total darkness at an unknown distance target that was exposed for less than half a second. It was the first and only shot fired by the shooter. He let that sink in. The recruits exchanged glances of disbelief. Such a shot was theoretically possible, but bordered on the supernatural. That shot, Thorne continued, was made by a sergeant who was here to observe. She never spoke a word about her skills. She never wore a single medal on her uniform. She never demanded respect. She simply was the standard. She taught us that competence is quiet. She taught us that your gear doesn't make you great, but discipline does. She taught us that the most dangerous person on the battlefield is the one you don't see, the one you don't hear, the one you underestimate. The story of that night in the simulation had become institutional folklore, a foundational myth told to every new soldier who passed through the facility. Thorne was no longer the villain of that story, but its chief disciple, the converted sinner who now preached the gospel of quiet professionalism. Sharma's legacy was not a name in a history book or a statue in a courtyard. It was in the way these new soldiers now moved, in the way they listened, in the way they approached their training with a newfound humility. Her legacy was a higher standard of excellence, a cultural shift that would save lives on battlefields yet to come. She had left nothing behind but a single, perfect hole in a piece of steel, and in doing so, she had changed everything. The true measure of a legacy is not what you achieve in your own time, but what continues to grow long after you are gone. It is not a monument carved from stone, which will inevitably crumble, but an idea planted in the minds of others, an idea that evolves, adapts, and spreads. Anya Sharma had been a ghost, a brief and silent visitor who held up a mirror to an institution and forced it to see the flaws in its reflection. She had demonstrated, in one undeniable display of silent mastery, the vast, empty chasm between loud arrogance and quiet competence. Her actions became a parable, a living lesson that transcended the simple context of a military training exercise. It became a story about the nature of true worth in any field of human endeavor. It championed the profound truth that respect is not a right to be demanded, but a consequence to be earned through action. The greatest professionals, the true masters of any craft, do not need to announce their presence. Their presence is felt in the quality of their work, in the standards they set, and in the positive influence they have on those around them. They move with a confidence born not of ego, but of countless hours of disciplined practice. Their silence is not an absence of knowledge, but a deep well of it, from which they draw only what is necessary. They understand that the loudest statements are often made in the quietest moments, and that a single, precise action is worth more than 1,000 boastful words. The world is full of noise, of people clamoring for attention, seeking validation through volume and aggression. It is easy to be distracted by the spectacle, to mistake the performance of confidence for the reality of competence. But true strength, the kind that endures, the kind that changes things for the better, is almost always found in the quiet places, in the steady hands, in the calm eyes of those who have mastered themselves before they ever sought to master their trade. The recruits listening to Thorne's story would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their careers. They would look at the quiet, unassuming soldier in their unit with a newfound respect. They would question their own assumptions. They would strive to be the standard, not just to meet it. This was the enduring legacy of the quiet sergeant. It wasn't what she left behind. It was what continued forward, a ripple of excellence spreading ever outward. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.